Hello, my name is Edward Kyle Ritchie, and I would like to welcome you to TruthInFocus podcast on all things Veritas. This is our first episode of what I aim to see as a growing series of reviews and open discussions concerning history and the present. Whether you're a Christian or an atheist, a conservative or progressive, it is my hope that you will hear a voice of objectivity despite differences of belief. As I begin this first episode in my home, I stare across at my bookshelf full of, and by full I mean exploding books, of every genre and belief and ideology you can think of. From Darwin's Origins of Species, or Freedom in the Making of Western Culture by Orlando Patterson, they share equal space with Church History by Alistair McGrath, or William Bennett's American, The Last Best Hope. Freedom of ideas are essential to a healthy understanding of life, and I aim to bring that to this podcast. And I'm happy to begin it with a book review of Rod Dreher's newest book, Live Not by Lies, a Manual for Christian Dissidents. Dreher is the senior editor at the American Conservative and author of several books, including The Benedict Option, which I also highly recommend. Dreher has written, unfortunately, a timely book, and I do not mean that in any negative way. Rather, is it an account all too surreal that has crept up on Americans, and only now are we, beginning to realize that the surreal is all too real. A softer totalitarianism, whose origins look all too familiar to that of the Bolshevik Revolution and the rise of Communist Russia. Roughly 217 pages, Live Not by Lies is a beacon in the night, a calling that the radical left are coming. The radical left are coming. Indeed, a radicalization of leftist origins has bellowed forth a monster whose fearlessness speaks softly, yet wields a rod of iron and loads of cash. A structure of modernity, neoliberalism, a merger of corporate and state, though Dreher never does use that language, but indeed he is right to surmise that the present behemoth of tyranny blows of leftist wind. However, we do not fail to recognize the authoritarian attitudes from our present populist president, Donald J. Trump, an idea not forgotten by Dreher nor I. However, what Trump represents is hardly the long-term danger that now hovers over every American, and dare I say, the Western world. What makes Dreher's book so convincing is that he has interviewed hundreds of former ex-Soviet Union citizens that suffered under hard totalitarianism. From torture, book burnings, constant government surveillance, and forced ideological brainwashing camps, over 50 million people have suffered due to the radicalism of Marxist ideologues who perceive themselves the slayers of God and the makers of men by their own willpower over others. If you think we are far away from such indignation, let me introduce you to the soft totalitarian practices and events covered in Dreher's book and a few unmentioned examples. I emailed Dreher after reading his book in just 2 days. That includes droves of notes, highlighting, and referencing. He has not responded yet, and he may not. I mean, he is a busy man after all, so no harm, no foul. But I hope that this review alarms and awakens listeners regardless of prejudices that may behoove you. Broken into 2 parts, Part 1, Understanding Soft Totalitarianism, and Part 2, How to Live in Truth, this book is for Christians, but without question, Dreher hopes it will gain the attention of a broader audience. Okay, so what's the problem? Essentially, for the last several decades, the United States has slowly etched toward totalitarian behaviors that do alarm the politically left and the politically right. It should therefore be said that while this book looks at the far left, the radical progressive, the critical race theorist, Black Lives Matter movement, Antifa, postmodernist radicals, or also I like to call all of these groups quasi-socialists. This is not about Democrats and Republicans. We're way past that stage, though we do see inklings of radicalism in the Democratic left, and, in my opinion, we are witnessing the eruption of the Republican Party, which also brings another kind of danger. Secondly, there is no denial from Dreher that the radical elements exist from the right. groups just like the alt-right, for example. But again, it is the radicalized left that we should all fear at present. With that affirmation, I completely agree. Well, okay, I do agree with everything that Dreher has to say. I mean, I did read his book in 2 days, thanking God that finally someone had realized that we are in deep, well, you know. Thirdly, Dreher rightly cites the premier scholar Hannah Arendt to describe what exactly is totalitarianism as opposed to authoritarianism and other strains of ism. Quote, a totalitarian society is one at which an ideology seeks to displace all prior traditions and institutions, with the goal of bringing out all aspects of society under control of that ideology. End of quote. Of course, I commend my listeners to read Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Live Not by Lies begins where the origin of his book would take place, a phone call. On the other side of the line, an American physician is scared out of his wit concerning his elderly mother. This woman was an immigrant and a prisoner for 6 years in her homeland under communist Russia. She had also been part of the Catholic anti-communist movement. Now, without explaining the whole story, she told her son that the events in America reminded of her when communism first arrived in Czechoslovakia. A quote from the introduction of the book reads, and I quote, "What unnerves those who lived under Soviet communism is this similarity. Elites and elite institutions are abandoning old-fashioned liberalism based in defending the rights of the individual and replacing it with a progressive creed that regards justice in terms of groups. It encourages people to identify with groups, ethnic, sexual, and otherwise, and to think of good and evil as a matter of dynamics amongst the groups. A utopian vision drives these progressives, one that compels them to seek to rewrite history and reinvent language to reflect their ideals of social justice." End quote. Now, truthfully, I cannot express to you how accurate that statement stands out on its own merit. Present discourse has eroded. Identity and identity politics has subscribed consumer culture as the sole means of reality. Be who you are. Your truth is truth, and life is what you make it. Perpetual lies now systematically injected as creedal statements, that if you do not recite them, at that moment, you can lose your job, your home, your family, and your friends. No, not the gulags. That is hard totalitarianism. But with fair warning, the gulags never come first. They always come later. I am reminded of the philosopher Alice McIntyre, who would not be too caught off guard by the projection of the self as God and King. For he wrote in his magnum opus After Virtue that it was, quote, wrong to separate the history of the self and its roles from the history of the language which the self specifies, and through which the roles are given expression. What we discover is a single history and not two parallel ones. End quote. What the self is projecting is illiberal at best, but I do not think that is the full picture. Patrick J. Deneen, professor of political science at Notre Dame, makes this exact point in his book, Why Liberalism Failed. It failed because of its own success. It has achieved its endpoint now full of contradictions, and irreality is left to hyper-individualistic state of the self, to decide between right and wrong, fake news versus the factual and the truthful, if such things even exist according to the late modern mind. Let us just enjoy the deep fakes without consideration of the real repercussions. All fun and games, right? Sex, porn, money, and drugs. That is what really matters. This is also where I actually appreciate the postmodern thinker Jean Baudrillard's critique of neoliberalism, the merging of capitalism and liberal ideology into the corporate state that I mentioned earlier, establishing itself as a global authority and globalization. Baudrillard warns us of a state, and I quote, hyper-real that has displaced the real because one thing has made it possible, technology, end quote. Late modernity has left us in a hyperstate, a warping of reality, knowledge, information, and life itself. Science and technology have made this possible, but at great detriment to the survival of humanity as we know it. Dreher captures this in essence, never spelling it out exactly as I just have. Rather, he spends looking at exactly what soft totalitarianism is and how we can prepare for it. This is perfect, not too philosophical or political in nature, rather a manual laying out the facts and then how to prepare in light of those facts. Dreher intertwines the stories of those persecuted under Russian totalitarian rule into our current events. In America, we have moved from a society that supports free speech to now censoring in the name of hate speech. Think your life goes unnoticed? Wrong. We live in a surveillance state with 24/7 tech hookup that traces, erases, gathers, and stores information. Google, Facebook, Twitter are only a few big names of social media who use social justice warrior policies to control present society. Race and gender are defining factors of reality, not merit. Even though gender itself is fluid or not real, depending on who you ask, as the gender revolution wreaks havoc on women and children, even to the point of their own erasure of womanhood. Do you have the sensitivity training in your corporate office? Well, I bet it includes diversity, inclusion, and equity training. Are you white? Well, you are guilty as charged for being a phobic, fill-in-the-blank, racist, and hurtful savage that requires training and punishment for your crimes against all minorities in all of human history. Go, take a seat, shut up, and do your anti-racism training or pay the cultural price. Chapter 4 of Live Not by Lies, in the last section of Part 1 of the book, is titled Capitalism, Woke, and Watchful. That chapter hit home for me. Dreher begins the chapter with Kamila Bendova, who once held underground seminars for the anti-communist movement. Quote, I mentioned to her that tens of millions of Americans have installed in their houses so-called smart speakers that monitor conversations for the sake of making domestic life more convenient. Kamila visibly recoils. The appalled look on her face telegraphs a clear message. How can Americans be so gullible? End quote. Robert O'Hara Jr., author of No Place to Hide, published in 2005, paints how our world is under the merger of private and public, government agencies and private corporations, who gather, share, sell, package, and store information on every citizen in the United States and increasingly around the globe. The politically aligned left and right ought to share a place of real fear over this usurpation of power. I cannot tell you the countless books written by progressives warning against the rise of corporations in America. Now, however, Amazon and the New York Times, MSNBC, only to name a few powerhouses, align with the radical left and their goal to build their utopia off the back of capitalism and liberal success. A success of excess turned to decadence that now slowly decays our planet and all known structures of true reality. The family structure, principles of liberty, and ideas pertaining to religious belief and freedom are soon to face even harsher penalties for even existing. It reminds me of Ayn Rand's book Anthem, which I will quote here. Quote, Our name is Equality 7-2521, as it is written on the iron bracelet which all men wear on their left wrists with their names upon it. We are 21 years old. We are 6 feet tall, and this is a burden, for there are not many men who are 6 feet tall. Ever have the teacher and the leaders pointed to us and frowned and said, There is evil in your bones, Equality 7-2521, for your body has grown beyond the bodies of your brothers. But we cannot change our bones nor our body. End quote. In part 2 of the book, How to Live in Truth, section after section covers how the past oppressed saints lived under communism. And I say saints in relation to those who were faithful Christian believers. One of the key institutions that kept them alive was their faith, a true testimony of our living Christ who sustains us. Chapter 5 is titled, Value Nothing More Than Truth. Essentially, do not be afraid to not compromise on your core beliefs, even to the point of making sacrifices in your careers, opportunities, associations, and even choosing not to vote. On page 105, it reads, I quote, "If your soul is free, then your thoughts are free, and then your words are going to be free." End quote. As Christians, that means holding to Christ and His Word, even, as Dreher mentions the next few pages over, choosing to remain silent, refusing to allow the media or schools to propagandize your children. We must prepare to make sacrifices for the good, the beautiful, and the true. Chapters 7 and 8 lay out the necessity of family and religion. Chapter 9, solidarity with others who may not fundamentally agree with you, but are allied against a greater evil. And Chapter 10 reminds us of the value of suffering in times of real despair. What is coming our way is already here, and is only going to increase more in size and power and authority. There are countless instances now where a person is prevented in some form or some fashion from speaking out against a system of belief that runs countercultural to the radical leftist narrative. Earlier, I mentioned the term quasi-socialist. In my own research, I am now led to believe that it's not just a cultural system they want, but a total restructuring, including economic redistribution, so-called free education, free healthcare, free housing, and demands for other resources that will have to be divided by means of rationing. The desire for equity over equality, the demands for social justice over other forms of justice, and a push to reallocate resources are all plans for a bigger government, a greater, more powerful government, and as they know, a corporate control that will control us all. This is not a game. This is not a fake story. This is real news. This is reality. You can go look at progressives and conservatives across the board and see well-researched papers, books, and articles on this topic. This is socialism. This is quasi-socialism. This is a Marxist bent, but under a global capitalism that makes even the failures of socialism look good. But that veneer will eventually wash away, reality will set in, and the true appearance underneath will come out. Capitalism does have its flaws. It needs restructuring. It does need help. We need to stand out and step up and step forth and speak out against those injustices. I am by no means an absolutist, nor is Rod Dreher. Our legal and social and political systems are broken. Crony capitalism stands to win at the table. Don't let them. Go by, live not by lies. Take up your cross and choose to truly love others rather than live by lies. God bless, and I will see you next time. This is Edward Kyle Ritchie at Truth in Focus and All Things Veritas. You can see my blog, Truth in Focus, at edwardkyleritchie.org or edwardkyleritchie.com. And you can listen to Truth in Focus podcast and on All Things Veritas, where you can also see Christ in the Coffee and more videos to come. And you can also see our Instagram page of Mere Beauty and Truth. Thank you for listening.